Hello everyone and welcome into another edition here of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in on this chilly tri-state area Monday afternoon. But hopefully this show will brighten your day just a little bit. We should have a great one ahead. All things college football playoff championship, and also talking about what could potentially be next for the two semifinalists in Texas and Penn State. But all eyes on tonight between Ohio State and Notre Dame for all the marbles in the CFP championship game. Also, we'll be talking about belatedly the Mike McCarthy firing and the impact that will have on Dallas and their search for a new head coach. And also previewing an exciting matchup again in the Western Conference in the NBA, because that is the better, more loaded conference between the Wolves and the Grizzlies. Big one over there. But before we get into any of that fun stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network if you need or want content such as this to keep up to date with all the shows going on around the network. But if you want to interact and contribute a little bit more directly to our shows, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, to get your opinions and thoughts and input out on air. I love reading all your comments. It just makes my show that much better, and it is genuinely appreciated by all concerned. But without further ado, let us jump right into our first segment, talking about tonight's CFP championship game between these two blue blood programs in Ohio State and Notre Dame. And it should be a good one. Let's talk about how these two teams got here, because we seem to forget that potentially both of these teams, if it weren't for the 12-team format, would not be here at all. And after two puzzling losses, the way these two teams regrouped, rebranded their identities, really was something to behold in the modern college football era. Let's start off with Notre Dame, because ever since week 2, it felt like they had to play every game like it was a playoff game, because they knew they had no margin for error, because that NIU loss was one of the most embarrassing of any team this season. And now they find themselves one win away from a national championship by having the most aggressive, passionate brand of football in all of college. On the Ohio State side of things, another loss to Michigan. This one perhaps the most embarrassing, heartbreaking, and baffling in Ryan Day's entire era as the Ohio State coach. Led them into the CFP with a lot of questions, potentially whether or not they should even be in the CFP. But they have thus far looked like the best team in the CFP. All the talent is producing at elite levels. Will Howard looked like the best quarterback in the CFP to date, and they are one win away from winning a national championship as well, and Ryan Day's first, potentially kind of dispelling the notion that he can't win the big games and he can't achieve what Ohio State fans want. But in terms of how this game will pan out, I think there are some clear and obvious advantages that both teams have, but also really important questions that need to be answered. And I think in my keys to victory for both of these teams, they're quite clear in terms of how they need to attack and approach this game. So without further ado, let's jump right into the keys to victory before I give my final predictions for this game. And unfortunately, it seems like I may have... No. I do have the graphic here for this game to explain my keys to victory. But ultimately, I do think that everyone is starting to understand what needs to happen for either Ohio State to perform how a lot of people expect them to, or Notre Dame to pull out the surprising upset. Let's start with Ohio State and what they need to do, because as always, the one question opposing defenses have to answer is, how are we going to stop Jeremiah Smith? But Ohio State also gave a blueprint into how they could operate should Jeremiah Smith be stopped, and I think that is their key to victory. Should Notre Dame, much like Texas tried to do in playing zone coverage, change their philosophies, Ohio State needs to exploit the middle of the field, because they have exceptional route runners outside of Smith as well. And Will Howard did an exceptional job in that game against Texas taking what Texas gave him, which was the middle of the field where Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate, and G. Scott exceptionally were able to ultimately give Will Howard that security blanket, despite Jeremiah Smith being blanketed on seemingly every single target. But I do think that, seeing as to how Notre Dame have gotten to this point by staying true to who they are, despite all these people saying, you need to change this, you need to change that, something needs to diversify, I think that Notre Dame are going to play man coverage from here on out. Throughout the entirety of this game, look for Notre Dame to stick with their identity, and that means that you run the risk of Jeremiah Smith going haywire on you. But if there are certain changes that Notre Dame do make as the game goes on, and if Ohio State starts to assert their dominance, look for Will Howard to adapt as well, because this Will Howard is different. With Kansas State, he didn't necessarily have that many weapons. He was, in my opinion, Kansas State's biggest weapon. Yes, he had solid running games there, but he never had receivers who could help him as much as this Ohio State receiving corps. And now it's allowed him to settle in as more of a pocket passer and allow these targets to get open for him no matter the coverage they face. And because of Jeremiah Smith being such an exceptional receiver, it now offers him even more opportunities to create down the field. And so, if I'm Ohio State, and I know that Notre Dame plays man coverage more than anyone in the country, I'm going to Jeremiah Smith, first and foremost, for the explosive plays. But if they do change things up, Will Howard has shown that he's competent at dissecting the middle of the field, taking what the defense gives him and ultimately extending and sustaining drives, which is what Ohio State loves to do when they can, because it's all fine and dandy to have explosive plays, but that could lead to this game becoming kind of a tete-a-tete shootout. Potentially, Notre Dame could stick around in that manner because they're, in my opinion, the better offense in terms of controlling the football up to this point. So I do think that both options are available for Ohio State. Because Notre Dame plays man coverage, the explosives will be there, or if Notre Dame switches up their style at some point in the game, I think that Will Howard has the blueprint to dissect that as well. So in my opinion, Ohio State are the clear favorites because they have two game scripts. One where Notre Dame changes and one where they don't. So it's going to be very difficult to slow down Ohio State. But in terms of Notre Dame, I think it's quite simple. I don't know if they're going to do this or achieve it for that matter, but do follow Texas' blueprint at some point. Because if you play man coverage for the entirety of the game, this one's getting out of hand. And this is no indictment on your defense, which has been incredible to this point. But think about it. Your best aspects of your defense lie in the secondary. You have an incredible secondary. When you look at the pass rush, there are incredible players up there. I love Howard Cross when he's healthy. But ultimately, the loss of Riley Mills leads me to believe that Notre Dame are not necessarily going to rely on their pass rush that much. They're going to have to rely on generating takeaways, which ultimately could happen because Will Howard is still that mistake-prone quarterback. You could potentially stay in this game by generating enough takeaways off of Will Howard's mistakes, but you can't necessarily think of that as much as you have to think about this receiving core, because this receiving core is one that really tests your patience, your resolve, most importantly, your mentality. And so, if Notre Dame follows the Texas blueprint, it means that they're going to have to trust their defenders to play a scheme that they don't necessarily play that often against perhaps the most elite receiving core in the entire nation. And so, in the final game of the season, this is really critical, because a lot of people might think otherwise. Why change up now? Why, completely alter your identity to risk it all in a national championship atmosphere? But if I'm Notre Dame, I'm looking at your secondary and saying, I'm basically applauding you for all these people who believe this sentiment. I'm basically saying this Notre Dame secondary is elite enough to win this game for you. I know what they're capable of. They can generate takeaways unlike any other defense in the country, and I do feel that that could be the difference in this game, should Notre Dame ultimately win the turnover battle. But following Texas's blueprint for a team like Notre Dame, who plays man coverage on 57% of their dropbacks, the most in the nation, is easier said than done. Because, like I said, in a national championship game, you don't want to risk anything. But it's Ohio State on the other side of the football. This is a team that has completely ravaged the field in the CFP. And no matter what happened before, this team should, for all intents and purposes, win this game going away. But the only way I see Notre Dame really stepping up to this challenge is by trusting the secondary in an uncomfortable situation. Because that's what you need to do. I mean, yes, you can say that Texas was a little bit better equipped because of their zone coverage looks they've done throughout the season, but I do think that Notre Dame's secondary is just as good as that Texas secondary, and they can handle the pressure of playing zone coverage, in my opinion. But ultimately, it's up to them, and it's up to their style of play and how they want to attack this Ohio State offense. And then in terms of Notre Dame offensively, it's establishing the run. We all know what they're going to try to do to compensate for the many ways this Ohio State defense can attack them. But ultimately, it's going to come down to the defense for Notre Dame in winning this game. In terms of predictions, though, I do think Notre Dame, for a certain period of time, will stick around in this one, but I'm not necessarily confident they'll be able to stick around when it matters. Ohio State will begin to pull away, say, in the latter stages, the third heading into the fourth, and win this one 31-20, in my opinion. And it will ultimately come down to the fact that Will Howard is efficient enough should Notre Dame alter their defensive identity, say at halftime or so, in order to compensate for Jeremiah Smith, and that will be the difference. But let me know what you think of this game in the comments. It should be a good one tonight at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. But coming up next, we're going to be talking a little bit belatedly about this Mike McCarthy firing and how it could impact the Dallas Cowboys and their search for a new head coach right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.